After careful analysis, it's clear that the West has decisively outplayed Mr. Putin. In this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, America stands as the biggest winner. Even if Russia manages to seize some territory, it will forever contend with a newly emboldened and fiercely anti-Russian Ukraine on its border. If Russian leadership had been more strategic, they might have avoided falling into what now appears to be a carefully laid trap. For Putin, this war has become an unmitigated disaster. The PR battle has been completely lost. Russia's global reputation is in shambles, and trust in its leadership is eroding fast. For decades to come, Russia will be seen as an isolated, unreliable pariah state. This plays directly into the West's broader strategy, cutting Russia off from key economic and diplomatic alliances, particularly with China. With Russia ostracized, China is left with a weakened, resource-rich partner, little more than a supplier of raw materials rather than an equal geopolitical force. From a strategic perspective, the West has effectively divided and conquered. China has been ramping up its military spending for over a decade, building a formidable navy and expanding its arsenal. However, much of its strategic thinking remains anchored in 20th century warfare. Russia, meanwhile, has tried to break free from outdated military doctrines, but lacks the foresight to navigate the modern geopolitical landscape effectively. China will gladly continue extracting Russian resources to fuel its massive population and industrial machine, but Russia's future looks bleak. Its leadership has failed to recognize the shifting tides of history. Oligarchs, once the pillars of Russian power, are increasingly threatened by technological advancements and growing competition. Every new innovation cycle makes it harder for old guard elites to maintain their grip on power, as automation and global economic shifts render traditional industries obsolete. For those who have read about the Great Reset, it's evident how drastically the world will change in the next 2 decades. Advancements in robotics, automation, and material processing will reshape global industries. Meanwhile, Russia, obsessed with resource extraction, risks being left behind. The longer it clings to outdated economic models, the further it will fall into irrelevance. A prolonged conflict could turn Russia into a battlefield of attrition, leading to further isolation from the West. Russian generals continue to repeat the same mistakes, even as Putin shifts towards a prolonged war strategy. Yet every time Russian forces retreat, they inadvertently supply Ukraine with tanks and armored vehicles. As a result, nearly half of Ukraine's armored forces now consist of captured Russian equipment, over 400 tanks and more than 600 armored vehicles. As one article succinctly puts it, NATO is a $40 trillion economic bloc, while Russia is a $1.7 trillion economy. NATO spends 2% of its GDP on defense, meaning no matter how much Russia allocates, Putin doesn't stand a chance. This highlights Russia's failure to plan for the long term, its squandered economic opportunities over the past 2 decades, and its fundamental misunderstanding of its own economic vulnerabilities. Russia's largest asset, its oil and gas exports, was also its greatest weakness. By invading Ukraine, Putin accelerated Europe's transition away from fossil fuels by at least 2 decades, cutting off a major revenue stream. Putin underestimated Ukraine, considering its resources and politicians to be weak. However, NATO and US support turned Ukraine's forces into a well-prepared military, honed by 8 years of training exercises in eastern Ukraine. Russia's planned 3-day invasion quickly unraveled into a prolonged quagmire. The Kremlin's continued belief that victory is achievable speaks to its inability to grasp the broader geopolitical consequences of its actions. Historically, Russian nobility has always sought to dominate, while the peasants have fought for their freedom. Today, NATO is backing the latter. The scale of resistance has made it nearly impossible for Russia to suppress Ukraine, and the conflict is accelerating a shift towards more transparent and less corrupt governance structures. Russia's economic future looks grim. Having isolated itself from Europe, it now faces the logistical nightmare of rerouting its oil and gas to Asian markets. Without Western expertise in energy infrastructure, restarting shuttered wells will be prohibitively expensive. The United States previously leveraged oil production to weaken Russia's economy after its invasion of Georgia, and history is repeating itself. With approximately 1/3 of Russian energy exports going to China and India, about half of its $160 billion in energy export revenue is at risk. Beyond energy, Western sanctions have cut Russia off from critical technologies, including hydraulic turbines, airplane parts, CPUs, and other high-tech services. The departure of foreign investment, coupled with rampant corruption, is leading to economic stagnation. Many professionals are leaving the country, further exacerbating brain drain. Unless there is political change, Russia faces decades of decline, becoming increasingly dependent on China. In many ways, Russia operates as a mafia state. In developing nations, where institutions are weak and corruption is rampant, such systems often take hold. As Socrates argued in the Republic, democracy is only as effective as the education system that supports it. Without an informed electorate, societies fall prey to demagogues. Ancient Athens learned this the hard way, with figures like Alcibiades leading them into disastrous military campaigns. Modern Russia mirrors this dynamic, with Putin acting as a feudal ruler backed by oligarchs. These oligarchs sustain their wealth and power through their connection to the Kremlin, reinforcing a corrupt system. Historically, corruption has stifled Russia's economic potential. Business leaders lack faith in the judicial system, discouraging investment and expansion. Instead of reinvesting profits into growth, they hoard wealth defensively. Property rights remain unreliable, and successful businesses are frequently targeted for extortion. Putin's economic promises have largely failed to materialize. Real wages have declined for 5 consecutive years, and state pension cuts have further strained the population. Trust in Putin has plummeted, and GDP growth remains sluggish, failing to exceed 0.5% in early 2019. Foreign direct investment has all but disappeared, and without Western oversight, corruption in Russian businesses will only worsen. The Russian proverb, "Ne podmasesh, ne poidesh," if you don't grease the wheels, the cart won't go, encapsulates this reality. Bribery is the norm, from healthcare and education to the military. Russia's economic model under Putin is built on crony capitalism. The state controls the largest revenue-generating sectors while allowing corruption to persist elsewhere. This system may provide short-term stability, but it is unsustainable. Without structural reforms, Russia will remain stagnant, unable to compete with the West in innovation or economic growth. Ultimately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has accelerated its decline. By isolating itself from Western economies and technologies, it has set itself back decades. The war has exposed the weaknesses of its military, economic, and political systems. Without fundamental change, Russia risks becoming little more than a dependent state propped up by China, a far cry from the global superpower Putin envisions. Conclusion: Russia's entrenched pay-to-win culture helps explain why the country's elite steal billions in budget money with little resistance from the public. After all, they are simply doing what everyone else does, just on a grander scale. If Russia fails to invest in its people, its influence on the global stage will likely wane. However, growing international isolation and a dwindling energy supply, estimated to last only a decade, might serve as motivation for change. Corruption in Russia is so pervasive that not even Putin can eradicate it. The sluggish implementation of national projects has frustrated the Kremlin, prompting Putin to publicly reprimand deputies on live television. While these projects are Russia's primary investment program, critics argue that improving the business environment has been neglected. The International Monetary Fund estimates that the initiative may only boost Russia's economic potential by 0.5%. Putin appears to believe that market forces and the rule of law are inadequate to curb corruption swiftly enough. As a result, he maintains control over the sectors where the state spends and earns the most money, enforcing his own rules rather than legal frameworks. It It is ironic to see Russians decry foreign sanctions and asset seizures when, for decades, similar tactics have been used against domestic business owners who failed to align with Putin. Now, Russian oligarchs are mysteriously dying, often under suspicious circumstances, and the business community lacks faith in the country's justice system. Putin's Russia has become a playground for loyalists and a graveyard for those who dissent. Coup attempts are futile in a state where the secret police monitor every move. Historically, the CIA and other intelligence agencies have operated similarly to the Kremlin, toppling leaders before they gained power. The real question is how long Russia can sustain this approach before facing the consequences of its own destabilization efforts. Based on the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict, Russia may only have a decade before its internal structure collapses, unless it finds new resources to exploit. The country's reliance on corruption is unsustainable when import-export balances are deeply negative. The West, particularly bankers and elites, has long viewed Russia as a reservoir of raw materials. Environmental concerns are silenced in Russia, where speaking out can be deadly. The re-emergence of Soviet-era symbolism underscores the continuity of oppression and political paranoia. In Soviet times, citizens feared spies among their friends. Today, Russians who oppose the war risk becoming another statistic. Putin's primary objective in Ukraine was securing the Donbas region, necessary for Crimea's water supply. However, the invasion was also driven by oil and gas interests. Wars are rarely fought without energy as a key factor. With dwindling domestic energy reserves, Russia sought to acquire new ones in Ukraine. Ironically, the war has backfired. Sanctions have blocked Russia from selling its oil, extending its reserves but crippling its economy. The long-term costs for Russia are staggering. The country is hemorrhaging talent, and as sanctions take hold, Moscow's economic prospects will deteriorate for the next administration. Russia's banking ambitions in Europe are now obsolete, with its financial institutions locked out of the global system. European banks, now free from Russian competition, stand to benefit. A Russian victory in Ukraine would merely mask the broader economic devastation, the fire sale of Russian assets in Europe, and the freezing of central bank reserves. The West strategically baited Russia into invading by presenting Ukraine as weak, while secretly arming its forces. The miscalculation forced out politicians who had banked on Russian energy, shifting power dynamics across Europe. Wars often benefit financial elites rather than soldiers on the battlefield. Western bankers and military-industrial players will capitalize on prolonged tensions, stripping Russia of its assets at bargain prices. Russia's invasion has cost the country 3 decades of post-Soviet growth, and it will take at least another 3 decades to recover. One can only hope Russia corrects its course before it becomes a cautionary tale of economic and geopolitical decline.